For 40 years, Walter Thompson tended the gardens of Oakwood Country Club. Each rose, each tree, each blade of grass knew his touch. The members walked past him daily, seeing a simple groundskeeper. They never noticed the quiet dignity in his weathered hands until Franklin Pierce arrived. The new committee chairman had grand visions, modern renovations, palm trees in Tennessee soil, and a plan to develop land that wasn't his to claim. What Pierce never realized was that the invisible black gardener he dismissed actually owned the most valuable part of the prestigious country club, land that had been in the Thompson family for generations. When a devastating storm reveals the truth about Pierce's changes, Walter must decide whether to fight for his legacy or watch 40 years of careful stewardship be destroyed. Will an elderly gardener stand against power and privilege? Will the community recognize the true owner of Oakwood's soul? This is a story about dignity over revenge, about justice over retaliation, about a man who planted seeds he knew he might never see bloom. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their appearance or position? Share your story in the comments below and join our community of storytellers who believe in the power of dignity and respect. The morning dew still clung to the perfectly manicured grass as Walter Thompson made his way across the sprawling grounds of Oakwood Country Club. At 72, his movements were deliberate yet efficient, each step the product of 4 decades of the same daily ritual. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of amber and gold that reflected off the pristine ponds dotting the championship golf course. Walter adjusted his worn canvas hat, a faded green that had weathered countless seasons alongside him. His weathered hands, strong despite the years, carefully inspected a cluster of prized tea roses near the clubhouse entrance. These weren't just plants to Walter, they were companions that had responded to his touch and care year after year. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," called a voice from the maintenance shed. "Morning, Jimmy," Walter replied with a warm nod to the young groundskeeper assistant who'd been working under his guidance for nearly 2 years now. Jimmy jogged over, clipboard in hand. "Got the irrigation report you asked for. Zone 3's pressure dropped again overnight." Walter nodded knowingly. "Third time this month. We'll need to check those connectors by the 14th green. The old copper's probably giving out." As they discussed the day's priorities, a fleet of golf carts emerged from the morning mist, carrying the early morning maintenance crew. Walter had handpicked most of them, training each with the patience and precision that had become his hallmark. At Oakwood, Walter was a fixture as permanent as the century-old oak that stood sentinel over the first tee. Members came and went, boards changed, and club presidents rotated, but Walter remained, his knowledge of every inch of the 200-acre property unmatched. He knew which patches of soil drained poorly after heavy rains, which greens required extra attention during July heat waves, and which trees were vulnerable during autumn storms. Yet despite his essential role, Walter moved through the grounds like a ghost. To most members, he was invisible, part of the scenery rather than its caretaker. The older members would occasionally nod in recognition, but newer generations swept past him in luxury vehicles, designer golf attire, and practiced indifference. "Mr. Thompson, those hydrangeas by the women's locker room look absolutely stunning this year," remarked Margaret Wilson, one of the few members who consistently acknowledged Walter's expertise. A retired judge in her late 60s, Margaret had been a member for over 30 years and served multiple terms on the board. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Changed the soil acidity last fall. The blues deeper this season," Walter replied, a hint of pride warming his voice. "Well, they're causing quite a stir among the ladies. Several are asking their own gardeners how to replicate them," she said with a knowing smile. After Margaret continued toward the clubhouse, Walter checked his watch. 6:45 a.m. He needed to finish his morning inspection before meeting Lisa, his granddaughter, at the Eastern greenhouse. At 24, Lisa was completing her master's degree in landscape architecture. Her talent undoubtedly inherited from her grandfather, though formally honed through education, Walter never had access to himself. Walter had raised Lisa since she was 8, after his son and daughter-in-law died in a car accident. Their small but comfortable home, just 3 miles from the country club, had become a sanctuary of growth, not just for Lisa, but for countless plants Walter brought home to nurture and experiment with before introducing them to Oakwood's landscape. As he approached the greenhouse, Walter spotted Lisa already at work, her tablet propped against a stack of seed catalogs as she sketched design concepts. Her natural hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and despite the early hour, her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Grandpa, you've got to see this rendering I finished last night," she called out, waving him over. "It's for the scholarship competition, a sustainable water garden design that recycles runoff from the clubhouse roof." Walter leaned over her shoulder, studying the intricate plans with a critical eye. "Smart use of the grade," he nodded approvingly. "You've included the native cattails I mentioned." "Of course," Lisa grinned. And those aquatic plants you showed me at the botanical garden last month. The judges are looking for water conservation elements, and I remembered how you handled that drought in '98. Walter smiled, his chest swelling with quiet pride. Everything he knew, every technique, insight, and solution developed through decades of hands-on work was finding new life through Lisa's formal education. What he had learned through trial and error, she was validating through research and modern methodology. Their morning ritual continued as they walked the grounds together, Walter pointing out subtle changes in the landscape that only experienced eyes would notice, while Lisa documented everything on her tablet, creating a digital archive of her grandfather's vast knowledge. "You know," Lisa said as they examined a troubled oak near the 7th fairway, "my professor was blown away by those seasonal planting rotation charts you helped me create. Said they were the most comprehensive he'd seen in 20 years of teaching." Walter shrugged modestly. "Just common sense after watching what thrives where season after season." "It's more than that, Grandpa," Lisa insisted. "It's institutional knowledge that's invaluable. You should be teaching master classes, not just maintaining someone else's property." Walter's expression softened. "This property's been as much mine as anyone's for 40 years. Every tree, every flower bed has my fingerprints on it. Besides," he added with a wink, "who says I'm not teaching? Got my best student right here." As they continued their inspection, several early morning golfers passed by, their expensive clubs glinting in the strengthening sunlight. Only one nodded toward Walter, the others looked through him as if he were merely another tree or shrub in their peripheral vision. Lisa noticed their indifference, her jaw tightening slightly. "Doesn't it bother you? The way some of them act like you're invisible?" Walter carefully pruned a wayward branch before answering. "What matters is the work, Lisa. This land speaks for me, always has." He gestured toward the vibrant landscape surrounding them. "Everything beautiful they enjoy here came from these hands. Whether they know it or not doesn't change that truth." Their conversation paused as Walter's radio crackled to life. "Mr. Thompson, we've got a situation at the main entrance. The new chairman of the grounds committee is asking for you. Seems pretty urgent." Walter sighed, exchanging a knowing look with Lisa. Franklin Pierce had been appointed chairman just 2 weeks ago, and already he demanded 3 meetings to discuss modernizing the grounds management. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes, Walter replied into the radio. "New chairman causing trouble already?" Lisa asked. "Man's been a member for 6 months and suddenly he's an expert on centennial oak care," Walter said with rare sarcasm. "Wants to cut maintenance costs by replacing half the perennial gardens with low-maintenance alternatives." Lisa shook her head. "The same gardens that have won regional recognition 4 years running." "The very same," Walter confirmed, gathering his tools. "Been maintaining some of those beds for 30 years. Each one tells a story about this place." As they walked toward the clubhouse, Walter straightened his posture and adjusted his work shirt, small gestures of dignity before what would likely be another challenging interaction. "I should get to class anyway," Lisa said, checking her watch. "My sustainable landscape design presentation is today." She hesitated, then added, "Remember what we talked about, Grandpa. You've earned respect here. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Walter nodded, watching his granddaughter walk toward the staff parking area, her confident stride reflecting a future bright with possibilities he'd never had. Whatever confrontation awaited him at the clubhouse, that sight alone fortified his spirit. 40 years he'd tended these grounds, through economic downturns, membership changes, and shifting management styles. The soil knew his touch, the plants responded to his care, and the landscape bore his signature more permanently than any clubhouse plaque or recognition. As Walter approached the clubhouse where Franklin Pierce waited, he reminded himself of a truth he'd long lived by. True ownership wasn't about names on deeds or titles on doors. It was about the investment of care, knowledge, and time. By that measure, Walter Thompson owned Oakwood Country Club more completely than any member ever could. The main clubhouse of Oakwood Country Club stood as a testament to old money and established power. Its colonial architecture, with imposing white columns and meticulously maintained brickwork, projected an air of exclusivity that had defined the institution since its founding in 1924. Walter Thompson approached the building with measured steps, his work boots leaving faint impressions on the pristine walkway he had personally designed with crushed granite that drained perfectly during Tennessee's unpredictable rainstorms. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Walter could see Franklin Pierce gesturing animatedly to a small group of men in pressed polo shirts and tailored shorts. At 48, Pierce had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, square-shouldered, immaculately groomed, with the perpetually tanned complexion of a man who played golf but never sweated. His recent success in commercial real estate development had catapulted him into Oakwood's upper echelons with unprecedented speed. "There he is," Pierce announced as Walter entered the clubhouse. "The man of the hour." Walter removed his hat respectfully as he stepped onto the polished marble floor. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce. I understand you wanted to see me." "Walter, we were just discussing the upcoming Founders Tournament," Pierce said, gesturing toward the three other committee members. "As you know, this is my first major event as Grounds Committee Chairman, and I want it to be spectacular." "Course is on schedule, sir," Walter replied. "We've been preparing since February as we do every year." Pierce's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, well, that's the past, isn't it? I've been reviewing the grounds budget and frankly I'm concerned about inefficiencies in your department." The other committee members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Walter's gaze. These were men who had known Walter for years, had complimented his work countless times, but now sat silently as Pierce continued. "I've taken the liberty of consulting with Precision Landscape Management," Pierce said, sliding a glossy brochure across the table. "They handle several championship courses in Florida, very modern operation." Walter glanced at the brochure without picking it up. "Oakwood has won regional excellence in course management 5 years running, Mr. Pierce. And that's commendable," Pierce replied with a dismissive wave. "But times change, methods evolve. These consultants have suggested we could cut our grounds maintenance budget by nearly 30% while enhancing visual appeal." Walter felt his chest tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "Might I ask how they propose to achieve this without compromising quality?" Pierce's smile broadened. "Synthetic elements in strategic locations, automated irrigation systems, outsourced seasonal planting crews instead of full-time staff." He leaned forward. "The members don't know the difference between your heirloom whatever they are and something that looks pretty from their golf carts." "Hybrid tea roses," Walter corrected softly. "Some varieties I've cultivated specifically for Oakwood soil conditions over 20 years." "Exactly my point," Pierce said, as if Walter had just proven his argument. 20 years doing things the same way, that's precisely what needs to change." One of the older committee members, Henry Blackwell, cleared his throat. "Franklin, Walter's methods have served this club exceptionally well, perhaps." "Perhaps we could discuss this after I've reviewed the consultant's full recommendations," Pierce interrupted. "For now, Walter, I need you to make some immediate changes before the tournament. The entrance needs more impact." Walter nodded carefully. "What did you have in mind, sir?" Pierce pulled out his phone and displayed a photo. "Something like this, palm trees lining the drive, tropical, dramatic." "Palms wouldn't survive our winter, Mr. Pierce," Walter said. "We're in hardiness zone 7. Those specimens would die by November." Pierce's expression hardened slightly. "They survive at Augusta National. With heated soil systems and replacements as needed," Walter explained. "The installation and maintenance costs would be substantial, not to mention environmentally unsustainable for our region." A flash of irritation crossed Pierce's face. "I'm not interested in excuses, Walter. I'm interested in results. The tournament is in 3 weeks, and I want those palm trees installed by next Friday." Walter took a measured breath. "Mr. Pierce, with respect, making such significant changes this close to a major tournament risks disrupting playing conditions. The excavation alone would." "I didn't ask for your opinion on the timing," Pierce cut in sharply. "I'm telling you what needs to happen." The tension in the room thickened as the other committee members studied their shoes or phones, unwilling to intervene. Walter had experienced dismissive treatment from members before, but rarely so openly and never regarding his professional expertise. "I'll need to consult with suppliers about availability," Walter said finally, his voice level despite the heat rising in his face. "Already done," Pierce responded, sliding another document across the table. "I've secured 30 specimens from a supplier in Florida. They arrive Tuesday. Your team will handle installation." Walter scanned the order form, his decades of experience immediately spotting potential issues. "These are Washingtonia robusta, Mexican fan palms. They're even less cold-hardy than." "They look exactly like what I want," Pierce interrupted, "and they're what we're getting." Walter folded the order form carefully. "Yes, sir, I'll make the arrangements." "Excellent," Pierce said, standing to indicate the meeting was over. "Oh, and I'll need a complete inventory of all equipment and staff responsibilities by tomorrow. The consultants want to conduct an efficiency audit next week." As the other committee members filed out, Henry Blackwell lingered behind, waiting until Pierce was engaged with a phone call. "Walter, I apologize for that," he said quietly. "Pierce has some powerful connections on the board. They're impressed with his business background." Walter nodded. "It's not the first time things have changed around here, Mr. Blackwell." "No, but," Henry hesitated. "Just be careful. Pierce isn't someone who handles contradiction well. He's made some comments about modernizing staff as well as landscapes." The implication was clear. Walter's position, secure for decades, was potentially at risk. "I appreciate the warning, sir." As Walter exited the clubhouse, he spotted Jimmy and the grounds crew waiting anxiously near the maintenance carts. "Everything okay, Mr. Thompson?" Jimmy asked. "We heard the new chairman wanted to see you." Walter considered his response carefully. We have some new directives for the tournament preparations. I'll brief everyone this afternoon. He wouldn't burden his team with his concerns yet. Throughout the day, Walter continued his rounds with his usual thoroughness, but his mind was occupied with Pierce's demands. The palm trees weren't merely an aesthetic misstep. They represented a fundamental disregard for the ecological balance Walter had carefully maintained for decades. That evening, as Walter reviewed nursery catalogs at his kitchen table, Lisa returned from her classes. "How did your presentation go?" he asked, momentarily setting aside his concerns. Lisa's face brightened. "Professor Jameson said it was one of the best in class. He's recommending me for that summer internship at the Botanical Research Institute." "That's wonderful news," Walter said with genuine pride. Lisa's smile faded as she noticed the scattered papers and his troubled expression. "What happened with that committee chairman?" Walter sighed, finally allowing his frustration to show. "He wants to install tropical palms along the main drive, Florida species that won't survive here." "That's ridiculous," Lisa said, examining the order form. "These will die after the first frost. It's a complete waste of money and resources." "Exactly what I told him," Walter replied. "But he's not interested in facts, only in making his mark." Lisa's expression hardened. "And you're just going to do it, plant trees you know will die?" Walter rubbed his tired eyes. "I have responsibilities to my crew. 6 families depend on those jobs." "But Grandpa." "There are ways to fight foolishness without losing your dignity, Lisa," Walter interrupted gently. "I've navigated worse than Franklin Pierce in my time." The next morning arrived with an unexpected development. As Walter supervised the morning maintenance routine, Pierce appeared in a golf cart, accompanied by 2 men carrying tablets and measuring equipment. "Walter, glad I caught you," Pierce called out with artificial cheerfulness. "These gentlemen are from Precision Landscape. They'll be conducting their assessment today instead of next week. I need you to give them complete access to everything: equipment sheds, greenhouses, personnel records, the works." Walter straightened. "Sir, I wasn't prepared for an audit today. Some of our documentation is—" "That's precisely the point," Pierce interrupted with a tight smile. "A real assessment, not a staged one. The board has approved this as a priority action item." The message was clear. This wasn't a consultation but an investigation, deliberately sprung without notice. "As you wish, Mr. Pierce," Walter replied, maintaining his composure though his jaw tightened visibly. "Jimmy will escort them to the maintenance facilities." Throughout the morning, Walter watched as the consultants photographed equipment, measured storage spaces, and interviewed his increasingly nervous staff. By lunchtime, they had compiled a substantial digital record of operations that had been under Walter's sole management for decades. Walter was inspecting irrigation heads on the 17th hole when he spotted Margaret Wilson approaching across the fairway. "Walter," she called out, her expression concerned. "I just came from a board meeting. Pierce is making quite a stir about modernizing Oakwood. I thought you should know he specifically mentioned transitioning to younger landscape management." Walter nodded solemnly. "I appreciate the warning, Mrs. Wilson. It seems my methods are suddenly considered outdated." Margaret frowned. "It's more than that. He's presenting himself as a cost-cutting visionary. Several board members are impressed with his corporate approach." She lowered her voice. "Walter, he's scheduling a full grounds assessment presentation for next week before the tournament. I believe he's building a case for outsourcing much of your department." As they spoke, a commotion erupted near the clubhouse. Walter turned to see Franklin Pierce standing beside one of Walter's prized rose gardens, surrounded by several tournament committee members. Even from a distance, Pierce's body language conveyed displeasure. "I should see what's happening," Walter said, excusing himself. As he approached, Pierce's voice became audible, sharp with disapproval. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. These outdated plantings completely obscure the view of the 18th green from the clubhouse terrace. This is prime spectator positioning for the tournament." Walter arrived as Pierce gestured dismissively at the carefully cultivated garden. "Mr. Pierce, these roses were positioned specifically to provide privacy for players approaching the final hole. It's a design element many professional golfers have commented favorably on." Pierce turned, noticing Walter for the first time. "Ah, perfect timing. Walter, this garden needs to be removed before the tournament. We need clear sightlines from the terrace." Several members shifted uncomfortably, aware of Walter's dedication to the gardens. Walter kept his voice level. "Those plantings are part of Oakwood's signature landscape design, sir. They've been featured in Golf Course Architecture magazine." "Magazine features don't increase member satisfaction," Pierce retorted. "Clear viewing areas do." This is exactly the kind of outdated thinking the consultants identified this morning. Walter felt eyes on him from all directions, members, his own staff watching from a distance, even kitchen workers who had stepped outside to observe the confrontation. "With respect, Mr. Pierce," Walter said carefully, Removing established plantings this close to a tournament risks disrupting soil stability and drainage patterns. We could consider a temporary solution for tournament viewing and address permanent changes after. This isn't a negotiation, Walter, Pierce interrupted loudly. This is a direct instruction from the grounds committee chairman, these bushes. Hybrid tea roses, Walter corrected quietly. Need to be gone by tomorrow afternoon, Pierce continued as if Walter hadn't spoken. And I expect full compliance with the rest of the consultant recommendations that will be implemented this week. A small crowd had gathered now, including several longtime members who had never witnessed such a public dressing down of a senior staff member. Walter felt the weight of every stare, heard the murmurs, and noted the uncomfortable glances exchanged. In that moment, with 4 decades of dedicated service seemingly dismissed in an instant, Walter faced a choice between public confrontation and dignified restraint. He thought of Lisa's passionate defense of his work, of his crew depending on his leadership, of the land that had been his life's canvas. I understand, Mr. Pierce, Walter said finally, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his face. The garden will be relocated. Pierce's triumphant smile confirmed what Walter already knew. This wasn't about gardens or sightlines. It was about power and establishing dominance. Excellent, Pierce said loudly. I knew you'd see reason eventually. Now about those palm trees, I want them featured prominently in all tournament publicity materials. Oakwood is entering a new era of excellence. As Walter walked away, the weight of what had just occurred settled fully upon him. In a single morning, his authority had been publicly undermined, his expertise dismissed, and his life's work characterized as obsolete. The tournament that had once been his department's crowning achievement each year was being transformed into a showcase for ideas he knew were fundamentally flawed. Yet as he returned to his greenhouse, Walter's steps remained measured, his back straight. The roses would need careful handling if they were to survive transplantation. He would start with the oldest specimens tonight, working by security lights if necessary. 4 decades of nurturing beauty from this soil had taught him patience above all else. What Franklin Pierce couldn't understand, what men like him never truly grasped, was that gardens like Justice operated on timeframes beyond human impatience. Some seeds took years to bloom, some roots grew stronger through adversity, and some battles were won not through confrontation but through outlasting the storm. The morning after his confrontation with Franklin Pierce, Walter arrived at Oakwood before dawn. The sky was still navy blue, stars fading as he made his way to the rose garden by the 18th green. In the dim light of his electric lantern, the roses appeared almost spectral, their delicate blooms hanging like memories about to be erased. "Didn't expect to find you here already," said a voice from behind him. Walter turned to see Jimmy approaching with several large transplant containers and tools. Behind him, 3 other grounds crew members emerged from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here this early," Walter said. "This isn't on the schedule." Jimmy set down his equipment. "We figured you'd try to save these roses yourself, thought you could use some help." Walter's expression softened. "This could take hours." "Then we better get started," Jimmy replied, handing out gloves to the crew. For the next 3 hours they worked methodically in the growing dawn light, carefully excavating each rose bush with generous root balls. Walter supervised each extraction, providing precise instructions to preserve the plant's health. By 8:30 a.m. they had successfully relocated half the garden to the nursery area behind the maintenance building. Not ideal, but at least the plants would survive. "Mr. Thompson," called one of the younger workers, pointing toward the clubhouse. "Look." A procession of vehicles was pulling into the service entrance, 3 large trucks bearing the Precision Landscape Management logo, followed by Franklin Pierce's Range Rover. Walter wiped the soil from his hands and walked toward them, maintaining a dignified pace despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. Pierce emerged from his vehicle, immaculately dressed in golf attire despite the early hour. "Walter." "Excellent, you're already at work. I've accelerated our timeline." He gestured to the trucks. "The Palm shipment arrived early and I've brought in Precision's installation team to handle things." "Mr. Pierce," Walter said calmly, "we're in the middle of relocating the rose garden as instructed. My team needs at least another day to complete the transplantation properly." Pierce consulted his watch, a gesture that had become increasingly irritating to Walter. "We don't have another day. The media team is arriving tomorrow to photograph the course for promotional materials." He snapped his fingers at the Precision crew emerging from their vehicles. "Clear that area immediately. The palms go in today." Walter stood his ground. "Sir, we haven't finished preparing the roses for relocation. If we rush this process, 40 years of cultivation will be lost." Pierce's expression hardened. "Walter, perhaps I haven't been clear enough. Your opinions on landscaping decisions are no longer required. The board has approved my modernization plan, which includes bringing Precision on as consulting managers for the tournament." Walter felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Consulting managers, my department has handled every tournament for decades, and now you'll handle it with proper supervision, Pierce replied dismissively. Consider it professional development. Before Walter could respond, a precision supervisor approached with a tablet. Mr. Pierce, we need to discuss the sprinkler system modifications before we begin excavation. Of course, Pierce said, turning away from Walter as if he had already forgotten their conversation. Jimmy appeared at Walter's side. What should we do, Mr. Thompson? Walter watched as the precision crew began unloading equipment, preparing to take over work that had been exclusively his domain for 4 decades. Continue with the rose transplantation, he said quietly. Focus on the oldest specimens first. Throughout the morning, Walter's team worked alongside the precision crew in tense parallel operations. Where Walter's methods were careful and deliberate, the precision workers moved with corporate efficiency, prioritizing speed over precision. By noon, they had cleared the remaining roses, some handled so roughly that Walter winced as he watched premium specimens tossed into temporary containers. As the first palm tree was positioned near the clubhouse entrance, Walter approached the installation supervisor. Those need proper drainage channels beneath the root balls if you're planting them that deep. The supervisor, a man half Walter's age wearing a branded polo shirt, barely glanced up from his tablet. We're following the specifications approved by Mr. Pierce. Those specifications don't account for our soil composition, Walter persisted. Without proper drainage, the first heavy rain will. Look, the supervisor interrupted, I don't tell you how to do your job, don't tell me how to do mine. Walter fell silent, the irony of the statement hanging in the air between them. That was precisely what was happening, outsiders telling him how to do the job he had mastered over 4 decades. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was well underway. A dozen Mexican fan palms now lined the entrance drive, their slender trunks looking startlingly out of place against Oakwood's traditional landscape. The cleared area by the 18th green had been hastily replanted with what Pierce called high-impact color, mass plantings of bright annuals arranged in patterns that reminded Walter of corporate logos rather than natural garden design. As Walter inspected the newly installed irrigation lines, he noticed several fundamental flaws in the system: connection points improperly sealed, pressure regulators installed backward, and shallow trenching that would prove problematic with the first frost. Mr. Pierce wants you in the clubhouse, Jimmy called from across the green. Said it's urgent. Walter found Pierce in the main dining room, entertaining several board members with animated descriptions of his vision for Oakwood's future. Large presentation boards displayed renderings of the course with dramatic lighting, modern water features, and architectural elements that bore little resemblance to Oakwood's traditional character. Ah, Walter, Pierce said without standing, perfect timing. We're discussing the opening ceremony for the tournament. I want the maintenance crew in new uniforms, something more professional than those faded polos your team wears. Walter maintained his composure. The current uniforms are specially treated to repel chemicals and pesticides, sir, safety equipment rather than fashion statements. A few board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Pierce pressed on. Well, for the ceremony, they'll wear what I've selected. The members need to see that Oakwood is embracing a modern, professional approach in every department. The implication was clear: Walter and his methods represented an outdated past that Pierce was determined to erase. Now, Pierce continued, turning back to the board members, about the water feature I've proposed for the front entrance. Walter stood silently as Pierce detailed more changes, each one dismantling another aspect of the landscape Walter had carefully crafted over decades. After 20 minutes of being effectively invisible in the room, Walter was dismissed with a casual wave. That'll be all, Walter. Make sure your team completes the mulching around those palms by evening. As Walter left the clubhouse, he paused on the terrace overlook, surveying the changed landscape. From this vantage point, the transformation was jarring, the elegant, cohesive design that had earned Oakwood its reputation now disrupted by incongruous elements that violated the property's natural character. Jimmy approached cautiously. Mr. Thompson, we have a problem with the new irrigation system. The main line to the 5th hole is leaking badly. Walter nodded. I noticed they installed the wrong type of connectors this morning. Let's see what we can salvage. For the remainder of the day, Walter and his team worked to mitigate the damage caused by the hasty installations, correcting what they could without directly countermanding Pierce's orders. As twilight descended, Walter stood by the maintenance shed, watching as the precision crew packed up their equipment, leaving behind a landscape transformed in all the wrong ways. Grandpa, Lisa's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She had arrived to pick him up as his truck was in the shop. What happened here? Walter gestured toward the entrance drive. Progress, according to Mr. Pierce. Lisa stared at the palm trees, their exotic silhouettes stark against the Tennessee skyline. This is ecological malpractice. These won't survive our climate. I know, Walter replied quietly, and you just let this happen? The disappointment in her voice was palpable. Walter turned to face his granddaughter fully. Sometimes, Lisa, you have to let people make their mistakes. Nature has a way of correcting human folly. They drove home in contemplative silence. After dinner, as Lisa worked on her assignments at the kitchen table, Walter retreated to his study, a small room filled with botanical reference books, carefully preserved gardening journals, and albums documenting 4 decades of Oakwood's landscape evolution. He pulled out his oldest journal, a leather-bound book from 1983, and began reviewing notes from his early years at the club. Each page contained detailed observations on soil conditions, plant responses, weather patterns, and the gradual improvements he had implemented year by year. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Lisa entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "I'm sorry about what I said earlier," she offered, setting a mug beside him. "I know you're in an impossible position." Walter accepted the apology with a nod. "This isn't the first time Oakwood has had ambitious leadership, Lisa. I've outlasted many chairmen and their grand visions. But Pierce seems different," Lisa observed, leaning against his desk, more determined to make his mark regardless of the consequences. "That's precisely his weakness," Walter replied. "He doesn't understand the land, doesn't respect it." He tapped his journal meaningfully. "Every change I've made at Oakwood came from listening to what the land needed, not imposing my will upon it." Lisa picked up one of the photo albums, flipping to images of Walter receiving an award for environmental stewardship in 1997. "Have you thought about showing the board these records? Your contributions to Oakwood are documented here." "Pierce isn't interested in history," Walter said. "He's fixated on his vision of the future." The next morning brought fresh challenges. Walter arrived to find 2 of his senior crew members reassigned to general labor under Precision supervision, while Pierce had installed a Precision manager in Walter's office to coordinate tournament preparations. Throughout the day, Walter was repeatedly countermanded, his instructions overridden and his expertise dismissed. By afternoon, he had been effectively reduced to following orders on the property he had managed for 4 decades. As Walter inspected the newly installed water feature, a gaudy fountain that wasted water and created maintenance headaches, Pierce approached with the club president and several important-looking visitors. "Walter, I want you to meet the tournament sponsors," Pierce announced grandly. "I was just showing them our spectacular new enhancements." Walter nodded politely to the visitors, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the growing knot of frustration in his chest. "Mr. Pierce has been telling us about the innovative approach Oakwood is taking," one sponsor commented. "These palms are quite striking." "Indeed," Walter replied diplomatically, "quite unusual for our region." Pierce shot Walter a warning glance before quickly redirecting the conversation. "We're breaking new ground in course aesthetics. Traditional thinking has its place, but Oakwood is looking toward the future." As the tour continued, Walter noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, a typical summer thunderstorm brewing. The weather radar that morning had predicted heavy rainfall. He approached Pierce discreetly. "Sir, there's significant rain approaching. We should secure the new installations before." "Not now, Walter," Pierce cut him off sharply. "These are million-dollar sponsors," Walter persisted. "The drainage modifications aren't complete. The 18th green could flood if—" "That's enough," Pierce snapped, loud enough for the sponsors to hear. "I'm sure we can manage a little rain without your catastrophic predictions." The sponsors looked uncomfortable at the exchange. Walter, acutely aware of how this appeared, stepped back with quiet dignity. "Of course, sir, excuse me." Within the hour, the storm hit with unexpected intensity, a deluge that overwhelmed the hastily modified drainage systems. Walter and his crew worked frantically in the downpour, trying to divert water from vulnerable areas, but the damage was already unfolding. The new annuals by the 18th green washed away completely, while muddy runoff from the disturbed soil around the palm trees created a significant management problem. As Walter was directing emergency pumping operations near the clubhouse, Pierce appeared under a large umbrella, his face livid. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded. "The terrace is flooding," Walter continued working as he replied. "The new drainage design failed, as I warned it might. We're mitigating as best we can." "I want this fixed immediately," Pierce insisted. "The tournament committee is meeting in an hour." "With respect, Mr. Pierce," Walter said, standing up to face him directly, rain streaming down his face, "this is the consequence of ignoring 40 years of landscape management experience. Some things can't be fixed immediately." Pierce's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting this is my fault?" "I'm stating that your decisions have consequences," Walter replied evenly. "Natural ones." For a moment they stood facing each other in the rain, Walter soaked but resolute, Pierce dry beneath his umbrella but increasingly aware of the chaos around him. Several board members had gathered on the covered walkway, witnessing the confrontation. "This is insubordination," Pierce finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "In front of club leadership, no less." "This is truth, Mr. Pierce," Walter corrected him. "Something this land has always provided, whether we choose to listen or not." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Security," he called to a nearby guard. "Please escort Mr. Thompson off the property immediately. He's suspended until further notice." A hush fell over the scene. Even the security guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the order. Walter had been an institution at Oakwood longer than most members had held their memberships. "Sir," the guard began uncertainly, "Mr. Thompson is managing emergency." "That wasn't a request," Pierce interrupted. "Either escort him out or join him in suspension." Walter raised a hand to calm the situation. "It's all right," he told the guard. "I'll go quietly." With deliberate dignity, Walter handed his radio to Jimmy, gave several quick instructions about managing the ongoing drainage issues, and then walked toward the staff exit without another word. He didn't look back at the property he had nurtured for 40 years, now partially underwater due to decisions made against his explicit warnings. As he reached the security gate, Walter heard his name called. Margaret Wilson was hurrying toward him, sheltered by an umbrella. "Walter, this is outrageous," she said, anger evident in her voice. "I've already spoken to several board members. Pierce has overstepped." Walter shook his head gently. "Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't the first storm Oakwood has weathered." "He suspended you for telling the truth," she pressed. "That's not acceptable." "The truth," Walter replied, gazing back at the property where muddy water now streamed across the carefully manicured fairways, "has a way of making itself known with or without my help." As Walter walked to the bus stop in the pouring rain, he carried with him not bitterness but a strange sense of certainty. In all his years of working with nature, one lesson had proven consistent. You could fight natural laws temporarily, but eventually they reasserted themselves. Franklin Pierce was learning that lesson today. What Pierce failed to understand, what men of his type never understood, was that true authority came not from titles or power plays but from respect earned through wisdom and experience. Walter had cultivated that respect like his gardens, patiently, consistently, with attention to the smallest details. And like his gardens, that legacy wouldn't be easily uprooted, no matter how determined the hand that tried. The morning after Walter's suspension, Lisa found her grandfather in his home garden, tending to the rescued rose specimens they had managed to salvage from Oakwood. Despite the previous day's humiliation, Walter moved with the same deliberate care he always showed his plants, his weathered hands gently pruning damaged stems and inspecting root health. "You shouldn't be out here so early," Lisa said, handing him a mug of coffee. "You deserve a day to rest." Walter accepted the coffee but continued working. "Plants don't understand human disputes, Lisa. They need care regardless of what happened yesterday." Lisa sat on a nearby garden bench, watching her grandfather with a mixture of admiration and concern. Jimmy called. "The flooding damaged 3 greens and most of Pierce's new installations. The palms are already showing signs of shock." Walter nodded without surprise. "Those palms were never meant for Tennessee soil." "Nature has its own way of rejecting what doesn't belong." "Pierce is blaming you," Lisa continued carefully, "telling everyone your sabotage of the drainage system caused the damage." Walter finally paused, wiping soil from his hands. 40 years at Oakwood, and I've never seen a man so determined to fault others for his own mistakes." He sighed, looking toward his small home office. "Perhaps it's time we reviewed some history." Inside, Walter unlocked a filing cabinet that contained 4 decades of meticulous documentation. Each folder was precisely labeled by year, containing photographs, maintenance records, design plans, and correspondence related to Oakwood's landscape development. "I've kept records of every significant change to Oakwood since 1983, Walter explained, as Lisa helped him carry several boxes to the kitchen table. "Not just what was done, but why and on whose authority." Lisa opened the earliest folder, finding yellowed photographs of a much younger Walter standing proudly beside newly planted oak saplings that now formed the signature alley leading to the clubhouse. "These trees were controversial when I proposed them," Walter recalled. "The chairman then wanted instant impact with mature specimens. I insisted on starting with younger trees that would develop stronger root systems." He pointed to a more recent photograph. 40 years later, those trees have survived 3 major tornadoes while other courses lost their mature plantings. Throughout the morning, Lisa and Walter systematically organized the documentation, creating a chronological record of Walter's contributions to Oakwood. The evidence was overwhelming. Award certificates, magazine features, letters of commendation from past chairmen, and detailed records of cost-saving innovations Walter had implemented over the decades. "Grandpa, did you ever realize you were creating an historical archive?" Lisa asked, holding up a 1997 certificate from the American Society of Golf Course Architects recognizing Walter's pioneering water conservation system. "I wasn't thinking about history," Walter replied. "Just doing things properly. Documentation protects the knowledge when memories fail." As they worked, Lisa's landscape architecture training allowed her to recognize something Walter had never formally articulated. His work at Oakwood represented a cohesive design philosophy that merited academic recognition. The intuitive knowledge he had developed through decades of hands-on experience aligned perfectly with contemporary sustainable landscape principles, though Walter had never had the formal education to frame it that way. "Your drainage design from 1994 is exactly what my professors are teaching now as cutting-edge permeable system design," Lisa noted, comparing Walter's hand-drawn plans with a textbook from her graduate studies. "You were implementing sustainable practices before they had names." Walter smiled modestly. "Just common sense. Water needs to move naturally." By afternoon, they had assembled a compelling portfolio documenting not just Walter's maintenance work, but his significant design contributions that had shaped Oakwood's identity and saved the club millions in operating costs over the decades. "This is more than enough to challenge your suspension," Lisa insisted. "Pierce can't argue with documented facts." Walter considered the organized evidence thoughtfully. "Facts don't always persuade men like Pierce. Their vision of the world leaves little room for correction." "Then we need allies," Lisa responded, pulling out her phone, starting with Margaret Wilson. An hour later, Margaret arrived at Walter's modest home, bringing with her news from Oakwood. "The situation has deteriorated significantly," she reported as Walter served coffee in his small living room. "The tournament committee is in crisis mode. 3 sponsors are threatening to withdraw after seeing the damage from yesterday's storm." "And Pierce?" Walter asked. "Doubling down," Margaret replied with evident frustration. "He's hired a damage control team to fix everything before next week's tournament. More precision crews arrived this morning with heavy equipment." Lisa spread several key documents on the coffee table. "Mrs. Wilson, we've compiled evidence of my grandfather's contributions to Oakwood. His designs have saved the club millions while winning multiple environmental awards." Margaret reviewed the materials with growing interest. "This is extraordinary, Walter. I had no idea you'd maintained such comprehensive records." "Documentation was always part of the job," Walter replied simply. As Margaret examined the evidence, her legal background became evident in her systematic questions and observations. "The board needs to see this," she said finally, "especially the cost-saving innovations you've implemented." In today's economic climate, that argument might be more persuasive than aesthetic considerations. Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Pierce speaks the language of business. Perhaps we should address him in those terms." "There's something else you should know," Margaret added, her expression growing serious. "Pierce has been making inquiries about the property boundaries on the eastern edge of the course, specifically the parcel containing the 17th hole." Walter and Lisa exchanged glances. "What kind of inquiries?" Lisa asked. "He's ordered a new survey and title search," Margaret explained. "Apparently, he has developers interested in portions of the property for potential commercial ventures adjacent to the course." Walter set down his coffee cup slowly. "The 17th hole parcel has a complicated history. It wasn't part of the original Oakwood property." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Walter crossed to a bookshelf and retrieved an old leather portfolio. "That land belonged to my grandfather, James Thompson." "Your grandfather?" Lisa asked, surprised. Walter nodded, spreading out yellowed documents on the table. "He was one of the groundskeepers when Oakwood was first established in 1924. Owned 5 acres adjoining the original property." The documents revealed a complex history neither Lisa nor Margaret had known. James Thompson, Walter's grandfather, had been one of the few black landowners in the area during a time when such ownership was rare and precarious. The 5-acre parcel had remained in the Thompson family even as Oakwood Country Club expanded around it. 1986, Walter continued, locating a faded agreement. "Oakwood needed to reconfigure the 16th and 17th holes for a major tournament. The club approached me about using my grandfather's land." "You own that parcel?" Margaret asked, examining the documents with increasing interest. "Inherited it after my father passed," Walter confirmed. "The club offered to buy it outright, but I proposed an alternative arrangement." He pointed to a specific clause in the agreement. "A 99-year usage lease with specific maintenance provisions." Margaret's eyes widened as she read the document. "Walter, this isn't just a usage agreement. According to this, you still legally own the land where the 17th hole sits." Lisa stared at her grandfather in astonishment. "You've owned part of Oakwood all this time. Why didn't you ever mention this?" Walter shrugged slightly. "Ownership was never the point for me. The land being properly cared for was what mattered." The agreement ensured the Thompson family legacy would be protected through proper stewardship. Margaret, now fully engaged in legal analysis, reviewed the document carefully. This agreement specifies that the land remains under Thompson family ownership, with Oakwood maintaining rights to use it for golf purposes only, contingent upon adherence to specific environmental management practices. She looked up at Walter. Practices that Pierce is systematically dismantling. So Pierce's changes might actually violate the terms of this agreement? Lisa asked. Potentially, Margaret confirmed. But more importantly, Walter, you've been the legal owner of that parcel throughout your time at Oakwood. If Pierce is investigating developing that land for commercial purposes, he's overstepping dramatically. Walter absorbed this information quietly. I never wanted to leverage ownership. The land was part of Oakwood in my mind, just with certain protections for its care. Well, Pierce has changed the equation, Margaret said firmly. He's not just altering landscapes, he's potentially violating a binding legal agreement and investigating commercial development of land he doesn't control. As they discussed the implications, Walter's phone rang. It was Jimmy calling with urgency in his voice. Mr. Thompson, you need to know what's happening. They're digging up the indigenous garden by the 17th hole, the one with all the native species you've been cultivating. Pierce says it's being replaced with a corporate hospitality area for the tournament. Walter's expression hardened slightly. That garden contains threatened plant species I've been preserving for 20 years. That's on your legally owned land, Margaret pointed out. He has no right to make those changes without your approval, especially changes that violate the environmental protections in your agreement. A new resolve settled over Walter's features. Lisa, can you drive me to Oakwood? I believe it's time I visited my property. 30 minutes later, Walter stood at the security gate of Oakwood Country Club, facing a young guard who clearly found the situation uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Pierce left explicit instructions that you're not permitted on the grounds during your suspension. This isn't about my employment, Walter replied calmly, handing the guard a copy of the property deed Margaret had quickly notarized. This is about accessing land I legally own. The guard examined the document with evident confusion. I'll need to call management, sir. While they waited, Walter surveyed the entrance drive. The palm trees installed just days ago were already showing signs of stress, their fronds yellowing at the edges. Nature was rendering its verdict far faster than Walter had anticipated. Minutes later, the head of security arrived, followed closely by Franklin Pierce himself, his face flushed with anger. What is the meaning of this? Pierce demanded. You're suspended, Thompson. That means you're not welcome on these grounds. Walter remained composed. Mr. Pierce, I'm not here as an employee. I'm here as the legal owner of the property containing the 17th hole. He nodded toward the deed in the security chief's hands. That parcel has been in my family's ownership since before Oakwood existed. Pierce snatched the document, scanning it with increasing dismay. This is nonsense. The club owns all this property. The club has usage rights, Walter corrected him, contingent upon specific environmental management practices that you're currently violating. A small crowd had begun to gather, curious staff, a few members, and several of Walter's grounds crew who had noticed the confrontation at the gate. Pierce lowered his voice, suddenly aware of the audience. This is a transparent attempt to undermine my authority. The board will. The board will be very interested to learn that Oakwood doesn't own all the land it operates on, Margaret interjected, having arrived separately, and that the owner of that land has specific rights regarding its management. Pierce's expression shifted as he calculated this new information. This changes nothing about your suspension, Thompson. It changes everything about what you can do to the 17th hole and its surroundings, Walter replied evenly. I'm exercising my right to inspect my property and ensure the protected native species garden remains undisturbed. The security chief, having reviewed the documentation, stepped away from Pierce. Sir, the deed appears legitimate. Legal ownership does grant Mr. Thompson access rights independent of his employment status. Pierce's face darkened, but he recognized the corner he'd been backed into. Fine, you can inspect your property. But you are not to interact with any staff or interfere with tournament preparations. As Walter walked through the gates with dignity intact, Lisa and Margaret flanking him supportively, a subtle murmur ran through the watching staff. For the first time since Pierce had begun his campaign to modernize Oakwood, Walter Thompson had successfully stood his ground. What Pierce couldn't possibly understand yet, what Walter had known for decades, was that true ownership wasn't established through declarations or titles. Grew gradually, like the roots of the centennial oaks Walter had planted 40 years ago, extending deep into the soil, anchoring themselves against storms and the changing seasons. Walter had always known he belonged to Oakwood just as surely as that 5-acre parcel did. The difference was, he now had documentation that even Franklin Pierce couldn't ignore. The emergency board meeting of Oakwood Country Club convened in the mahogany-paneled executive room 3 days before the Founders Tournament. Tension permeated the air as 14 board members arranged themselves around the oval table, with Franklin Pierce stationed at the head position. Walter Thompson sat quietly at the opposite end, his weathered hands resting on a leather portfolio containing decades of documentation. "This meeting will address the disruptions to our tournament preparations," Pierce began, his voice projecting confidence despite the circumstances. "I've invited Walter to provide explanations for the drainage failures that have compromised our renovations." Margaret Wilson, seated midway down the table, raised her hand. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman. This meeting was called to discuss multiple concerns, including the property deed Mr. Thompson has presented." Pierce's jaw tightened. "We'll address that speculation after the immediate tournament issues." "It's not speculation," Walter interjected calmly, sliding certified copies of the deed down the table. "The eastern parcel containing the 17th hole has been in my family's possession since 1924. Oakwood holds a 99-year usage lease, contingent upon specific environmental management conditions." A murmur spread through the room as board members examined the documentation. Henry Blackwell, the club's longest-serving member, adjusted his glasses. "I remember discussions about this arrangement during my first board term. It was considered a favorable solution for both parties." Pierce remained dismissive. "A historical curiosity at best, the club's operations can't be held hostage by outdated agreements." "The agreement is legally binding," Margaret countered, her legal background evident in her precise tone. "And Mr. Thompson's concerns extend beyond property rights. His 4 decades of expertise have been systematically ignored during these renovations." Walter opened his portfolio, distributing a concise timeline of the drainage modifications and their predicted consequences, all documented in emails Pierce had dismissed. "Every failure we experienced during the storm was specifically forecasted in these communications," Walter explained without accusation. "The documentation shows a pattern of disregarding expert guidance in favor of aesthetic preferences incompatible with our regional conditions." Board members exchanged concerned glances as they reviewed Walter's meticulous records. "The tournament begins in 3 days," Pierce insisted, attempting to redirect. "We need solutions, not accusations." "I've prepared restoration recommendations," Walter responded, distributing another document. "These can mitigate the damage within our compressed timeline." The board's treasurer, Elizabeth Chan, studied the financial implications. "These emergency repairs will exceed our contingency budget by 30%. The original modifications were already over budget." "Which modifications were explicitly advised against," Margaret added pointedly. As the discussion intensified, Pierce attempted to reassert control. "We're losing focus. The precision consultants have already implemented recovery measures. Thompson's suspension remains in effect until his insubordination is properly addressed." Margaret stood, commanding the room's attention. "Before we continue, the board should be aware of another matter." She distributed copies of a property development proposal bearing Pierce's signature. "This draft plan proposes commercial development of the eastern parcel, land Mr. Thompson legally owns." A stunned silence fell across the room. "Where did you get that?" Pierce demanded, color draining from his face. "From the Zoning Commission," Margaret replied evenly, "where you submitted preliminary inquiries last month before consulting either this board or the property's legal owner." The revelation transformed the meeting's atmosphere instantly. Board members who had been neutral suddenly focused intently on Pierce, whose ambitious modernization now appeared in a troubling new context. "Is this accurate, Franklin?" asked Richard Hargrove, a respected senior member. "Were you exploring commercial development of club property without board knowledge?" "It was preliminary research," Pierce defended, his composure cracking. "Exploring revenue opportunities is part of my mandate." "Not on land you don't control," Margaret countered, "and certainly not without board authorization." Walter had remained silent through this exchange, but now spoke with quiet authority. "I've never leveraged my ownership of that parcel because Oakwood's stewardship aligned with my family's values. That alignment appears to have changed." The board president, James Williams, who had been observing carefully, finally intervened. "I believe we need to reconsider several recent decisions. Starting with Mr. Thompson's suspension, which appears increasingly unwarranted." Pierce attempted one final stand. "The tournament preparations cannot proceed competently without proper expertise," Williams interrupted firmly. "Mr. Thompson's reinstatement seems essential to salvaging the event." The vote was nearly unanimous. Pierce sat rigid as the board formally reinstated Walter, authorized his recovery plan, and established a committee to investigate the commercial development proposal. As the meeting concluded, Walter gathered his documents without celebration or vindication. He understood that this wasn't a personal victory but a restoration of proper stewardship, the principle that had guided his 40 years at Oakwood. Pierce intercepted Walter at the door. "This isn't over, Thompson." Walter met his gaze with the same steady calm he'd maintained throughout their conflict. "It never is, Mr. Pierce. Gardens require constant attention, much like the truth." As Walter walked the grounds that evening directing emergency repairs with his reinstated crew, he felt no triumph, only the familiar responsibility of caring for land that had in many ways always been his birthright. Walter's reinstatement rippled through the Oakwood community like a stone dropped in still water. By morning, news had spread beyond the club's manicured borders into the surrounding town of Oak Ridge, where Walter had mentored generations of young gardeners and landscapers. Jimmy orchestrated the grounds crew's response, efficiently reallocating resources to execute Walter's recovery plan. The crew worked with renewed purpose, their pride restored along with their leader's position. Walter moved among them with quiet authority, correcting drainage issues and stabilizing damaged areas with practiced precision. The Tennessee Horticulture Association called, Lisa informed Walter as she joined him by the compromised 18th green. "They've offered volunteer assistance for tournament preparations. 20 professional landscapers will arrive tomorrow morning." Walter nodded appreciatively. "We'll need the help to meet our timeline." By mid-afternoon, the first wave of community support materialized. 3 pickup trucks arrived at the service entrance, carrying former apprentices Walter had mentored over decades. Among them was Marcus Jenkins, now owner of the region's most successful landscape architecture firm. "Heard you could use some expertise that actually understands Tennessee soil," Marcus called as he approached Walter with a firm handshake. "My crew's ready to work." Walter's expression softened. "This is club business, Marcus. You didn't need to come." "This is Thompson business," Marcus corrected him. "You taught half the landscapers in this county. We take care of our own." Throughout the day, more supporters arrived, former Oakwood maintenance workers, community garden volunteers Walter had advised, and botanical specialists who respected his ecological knowledge. Each brought tools, plants, and determination to restore Oakwood's integrity before the tournament. Club members' reactions varied significantly. Older members who remembered Walter's consistent contributions expressed relief at his return, while newer members aligned with Pierce's vision watched the community mobilization with skeptical distance. Margaret Wilson organized a group of longstanding members to document Walter's historical contributions, collecting testimonials and photographs spanning 4 decades. "We're creating an exhibition for the tournament," she explained to Walter. "The members need to understand Oakwood's living history." Pierce maintained a strategic distance, observing from the clubhouse as Walter's restoration plan unfolded with impressive efficiency. His commercial development scheme now scrutinized by the board, Pierce focused on salvaging his reputation by taking credit for the successful emergency response. By evening, social media buzzed with the story, not the version Pierce had initially propagated about Walter's incompetence, but accounts from community members detailing Walter's decades of environmental stewardship and mentorship. Local news outlets picked up the narrative of the groundskeeper, who legally owned part of the prestigious country club he had faithfully maintained for 40 years. "You've become something of a local celebrity, Grandpa," Lisa commented that evening, showing Walter several supportive posts from former students and community leaders. Walter shook his head modestly. "The work speaks for itself, always has." The following morning brought another surprise. As Walter directed the volunteer teams, a procession of luxury vehicles arrived. Emerging from them were some of Oakwood's most influential members, doctors, business leaders, and local officials who had previously remained neutral in the conflict. Dr. James Chen, a renowned surgeon and 15-year member, approached Walter directly. "My Japanese maple saplings survived 3 transplantations because of your guidance, Walter. My family has enjoyed them for a decade now." He gestured to the volunteers. "We'd like to contribute meaningfully to the restoration." Throughout the day, member support continued to materialize, not just in words but in actions. Several funded immediate replacement of damaged plantings. Others worked alongside the volunteers, discarding designer clothing for work gloves and sun hats. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. The hastily installed palm trees had been respectfully removed to greenhouse care, replaced with mature native specimens donated by local nurseries. The indigenous garden by the 17th hole, Walter's legal property, had been restored and expanded with threatened species from Walter's personal collection. Pierce made one final attempt to reassert control, arriving with a film crew to document his successful restoration effort. The resulting video captured instead the community's organic response to Walter's leadership, a visual testament to genuine respect earned through decades of humble expertise. As Walter surveyed the nearly restored landscape with Lisa and Margaret that evening, he reflected on the unexpected outcome of Pierce's campaign. He wanted to erase my influence, Walter observed quietly. Instead, he made it visible to everyone. That's the thing about roots, Lisa replied, squeezing her grandfather's shoulder. The deeper they run, the harder they are to remove. You've been planting yourself into this community for 40 years, Grandpa. Walter nodded thoughtfully, watching the sunset illuminate Oakwood's renewed landscape. The tournament would proceed with dignity, but more importantly, with integrity, not because Walter had fought for recognition, but because the community had recognized worth fighting for. The morning of the Founders Tournament dawned with perfect clarity, as if nature itself had approved of Oakwood's restored landscape. Walter arrived before sunrise, as he had for 4 decades, making final inspections with the practiced eye of a steward rather than merely a groundskeeper. The transformation achieved in just 3 days stood as testament to community solidarity. Every drainage issue had been resolved, disrupted plantings reestablished, and the course's natural harmony restored through the collective effort of professionals and volunteers alike. At 7:30 a.m., Walter met with tournament officials near the first tee, where Margaret Wilson stood with several board members. Walter, the board has unanimously approved a formal acknowledgement of your contributions, Margaret announced, gesturing toward an elegantly framed resolution. It will be presented during the opening ceremony. Walter reviewed the document with characteristic humility. The recognition is appreciated but unnecessary. The land speaks for itself. By mid-morning, spectators and participants filled Oakwood's grounds. The formal acknowledgement of Walter's 40 years of service received a standing ovation, contrasting sharply with the polite applause that greeted Pierce's subsequent remarks. As the tournament proceeded, Walter maintained a professional distance from the spotlight, focusing instead on ensuring impeccable playing conditions. The professional golfers, many of whom had competed at Oakwood previously, specifically sought Walter to complement the course's recovery and traditional excellence. Pierce maintained visibility throughout the event, positioning himself prominently for photographs and interviews. Yet the narrative had irrevocably shifted. Local coverage emphasized the community's response to Walter's leadership rather than Pierce's modernization vision. The tournament concluded successfully, with record attendance and unanimously positive feedback from players and sponsors. As the crowds dispersed and the grounds crew began post-event maintenance, Walter found himself approached by James Williams, the board president. "We need to discuss the future, Walter," Williams began, gesturing toward the eastern parcel. "Your property ownership creates both challenges and opportunities for Oakwood." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "I've been considering that very matter, Mr. Williams." The following week, Walter presented his proposal to the board, not as an employee seeking approval, but as a landowner offering partnership. The 5-acre parcel would remain under Thompson family ownership but would serve a new dual purpose, housing both the renowned 17th hole and a new educational center dedicated to sustainable landscape management. The Thompson Environmental Education Center would serve the broader community, Walter explained, as Lisa displayed architectural renderings she had developed. Local schools, aspiring landscapers, and environmental students would gain hands-on experience with sustainable practices. The proposal included collaboration with regional universities, apprenticeship opportunities for underserved youth, and curriculum development with botanical experts. What had begun as Pierce's attempted removal of Walter had evolved into a comprehensive vision for Oakwood's positive community impact. "This initiative aligns perfectly with our community engagement objectives," Dr. Chen noted, reviewing the financial projections, "and creates substantial tax advantages through educational partnerships." Pierce, relegated to a standard board seat after his authority was curtailed, attempted one final objection. "This fundamentally changes Oakwood's exclusive character. It fundamentally fulfills Oakwood's potential," Margaret countered firmly. The board's approval was unanimous, with Pierce's abstention noted for the record. 1 month later, Walter stood with Lisa at the groundbreaking for the Thompson Center. The ceremony drew community leaders, environmental advocates, and dozens of individuals Walter had mentored throughout his career. "My grandfather believed stewardship transcends ownership," Walter told the gathered audience. "This center continues that legacy, teaching future generations to care for land with knowledge, respect, and patience." As construction began, Walter gradually transitioned day-to-day grounds management to Jimmy, though he remained actively involved in major decisions and training initiatives. His new role as Director of Environmental Education leveraged his lifetime of knowledge in formal curriculum that would benefit countless students. Pierce eventually relocated to Florida, where palm trees flourished naturally. His brief tenure at Oakwood became merely a footnote in the club's history, while Walter's influence expanded through the educational center bearing his family name. On Walter's 75th birthday, Oakwood hosted a community celebration that filled the grounds with those whose lives he had touched. Former apprentices, current students, academic partners, and grateful members gathered to honor a man who had transformed a job into a legacy. "You always taught me that true ownership comes through care, not titles," Lisa told her grandfather as they surveyed the thriving landscape and bustling education center. "I'm only beginning to understand how many lives you've cultivated alongside these gardens." Walter nodded, his weathered hand resting on a young oak he had planted just weeks earlier, a tree he might never see reach maturity but had planted nonetheless. "The best gardens," he replied with quiet wisdom, "are the ones we plant for future generations to enjoy." The evening sun cast long shadows across Oakwood's landscape, shadows that would shift with seasons and years, but would always fall across land that Walter Thompson had shaped not through assertion of ownership, but through decades of faithful stewardship. In that fundamental truth lay the legacy that no title, deed, or recognition could fully capture. Some men claim ownership through power, but others earn it through persistent care. Walter Thompson had always understood the difference.